Mr. President, I rise today to speak about a pressing issue, really a crisis, and I don't use that word lightly, of some 52,000 unaccompanied alien children streaming across our southern border with Mexico coming into our country. And that number is continuing to grow. In fact, the Obama administration itself says that that number could reach 90,000 or more by the end of the fiscal year, October 1st, in just a few months. And again, as I said, this is a crisis on many levels. It's a border crisis, it's a national security crisis, it's a humanitarian crisis, it's a fiscal issue for our country. It is a very serious situation. I talked about it on the floor last week, laid out, broadly speaking, the policy response I think we need to have so this flow does not continue and to continue to grow. Today I come back to the floor and I want to talk about two things. Specifics I've learned about how this crisis is specifically affecting Louisiana. I'm real concerned about that. I'm sure every member here is concerned about direct impacts on their state. And number two, legislation I've introduced to directly respond to this crisis. And again, it is a real crisis. Louisiana, just in the last week or so, I've learned a number of things that are significant and that continue to raise my concerns. I wrote the Secretary of Homeland Security asking a number of detailed questions some time ago, including about Louisiana impacts. Unfortunately, I've heard nothing from the department. I've gotten no response yet to that letter, and I'm going to follow up and get a response. But in the meantime, these are specifics I'm hearing from other reliable sources. First of all, the Hirsch Coliseum in Shreveport, Louisiana, has been contacted, apparently, by the Department of Homeland Security about locating space for the housing of illegal minors in the Hirsch Coliseum, setting up a camp, if you will, a facility specifically for that. Now, no member of our delegation was contacted. I had asked specific questions about any activity impacting Louisiana. I wasn't told, but they were contacted directly. This isn't happening. It's impractical. It can't happen at the Hirsch Coliseum. They have a lot of commitments and a lot of things they need to do there. So I don't think there's any chance of this sort of detention facility being set up there, but they were contacted. In addition, thousands of new ICE cases regarding unaccompanied alien children. First of all, before the current crisis began, there was a backlog of these cases, of these UACs being sent to Louisiana with family members or sponsors. It's a backlog of about 2,000 cases. Then, apparently, since this crisis has started developing in the last several months, we have 1,259 new juvenile cases for Louisiana alone. That's a significant number for a state the size of Louisiana. These are folks being sent, we believe, through the Chicago detention facility to be united with family members or other sponsors in Louisiana. Again, this is exactly the sort of thing I'd asked the Department of Homeland Security about. I haven't gotten any response to my letter. I haven't gotten any official formal response to my specific questions. We've had to learn this ferreting through other sources, talking to some ICE officials and others directly. This is really concerning. And if this is going on in Louisiana, this is going on in every state of the country. And it underscores what a serious situation, and in fact, a crisis on many different levels this is. That's why last week I introduced legislation to try to address this very serious situation, this border crisis. I introduced S 2632 to address specifically the UAC issue. Let me outline broadly what it would do. And broadly speaking, it would make sure that we detain these individuals, don't release them to relatives, family members, sponsors, don't release them out into society, but detain them and have a much quicker, more efficient process for deporting them and returning them to their home countries. Specifically, we would have mandatory detention of all unaccompanied alien children or UACs upon apprehension. Number two, we would amend TVPRA to bring parity between UACs from contiguous and non-contiguous countries. As most senators know, we have a more streamlined, workable process for unaccompanied alien children from contiguous countries, namely Mexico as well as Canada, but it's much more of an issue with Mexico. We would bring non-contiguous countries, Central, South American countries apart from Mexico, into the same category and treat those aliens the same way. Third, those UACs that do not voluntarily depart, which is part of the process with dealing with Mexican UACs, will be immediately placed in a streamlined removal process and detained by the Department of Homeland Security. Currently, UACs are transferred to HHS and their Office of Refugee Resettlement, where they quite frankly disappear into the United States. They're reunified with parents or sponsors living in the United States, often illegally. What that means as a practical matter is they essentially disappear into our country. Fourth, anyone with gang affiliations, whether those affiliations are renounced or not, will be immediately placed in expedited removal proceedings under INA 235B, and therefore that would make them ineligible for asylum status. Fifth, we would raise the standard for asylum determinations from a standard where it is now, quote, credible fear, close quote, which is extremely subjective and quite frankly a standard that is too easy for these folks to meet simply by repeating the right magic words which they learn about as they come here. We would raise that standard from, quote, credible fear, close quote, to, quote, substantiated fear of persecution, close quote. Six, within 72 hours of an initial screening, all UACs found not to have a claim for asylum will be given a final removal order and placed on the next available flight to their home country, subject to determinations of cost, feasibility, and any repatriation agreements with their home country. Seven, a final order of removal is not subject to review and stands as a minimum 10-year bar to reentry. Eight, upon apprehension, biometric data, including but not limited to photographs and fingerprints, will be collected for future use, for enforcement use. And ninth, and finally, the Department of Homeland Security will report annually to Congress on the number of apprehensions, the number of removals, the number of voluntary departures, etc. And specifically, in no event shall a voluntary departure be counted as a deportation. Now, what does all this mean? It's a very detailed bill. We put great time and effort into the specifics of the legislation. You need to get the specifics right. But what does it mean? It means that we're stopping catch and release. It means we're stopping simply releasing these folks out into the country to family members or to sponsors where they're usually never heard from again. They don't show up for court dates. They don't respond to any enforcement actions. So catch and release is a complete failure because it essentially means being released in the country for an extended period of time. And it means we retain control and detention and then have a quick, efficient process for removing them from the country. That's the only way we're going to stem this increasing flow, still increasing, still the numbers mounting and mounting and mounting of unaccompanied alien children. You know, I called this a crisis at the beginning of my remarks, and it is. It's a crisis on many different levels. It's a border crisis. It's a law enforcement crisis. It's a fiscal issue. And as many folks, particularly on the left, have said, and they're right, it is a humanitarian crisis. And the biggest threat to these individuals in humanitarian terms is the fact that they are entrusted and put in the hands of criminal elements, outright criminal gangs, often drug lords, drug gangs, coyotes, folks who do not have their best interest in mind. And very often in that process, they are abused in multiple ways. That is a humanitarian travesty. That is a humanitarian crisis. Problem is, we have a policy right now that encourages that, and that encourages that treatment and those numbers to grow and not to be brought back down to zero. We need a different policy that discourages that, that stops that. And fundamentally, the way you do that is to apprehend these individuals, don't release them out into the country, which means their smuggling operation has been successful. The illegal gang smuggling operation has met with success, but quickly, efficiently deport them back to their home country. That is the only action that will reverse the message that's gone out far and wide in Central and South America. Send your minors, because President Obama had an executive order that says we won't prosecute them. So send your minors. That's the message that's been heard. That's the fundamental message we have to reverse. And you only reverse that message if you reverse the policy through specific actions like this. This is a graph, and it shows very clearly that deportations of this class of illegal alien has plummeted under President Obama, plummeted. Now, President Obama himself often points to a change in the law in 2008 that was part of that equation. He complained about that for weeks and weeks when this crisis first hit the front page of the paper. Problem is, when it came to his proposal sent to Congress about how to deal with the crisis, he didn't ask for any of that law to be changed. He didn't ask for any new authority to expedite the removal process. All he asked for was $3.9 billion, largely for the housing and feeding of these aliens, not for expedited and effective removal. So that's what we need to change. This trend line is what we need to change in order to address the problem and stop this mounting flow, this crisis at our border. I hope we act in a responsible way by adopting this sort of policy and catch and release. Detain these folks, of course, treat them humanely, provide what we need to provide for them in the limited period of time that we detain them, but don't release them into the country with family members, often other illegals or sponsors. Detain them and deport them back to their home countries. That's the only appropriate response that will stop this crisis from continuing to grow and stop the abuses and the humanitarian crisis from continuing to grow. I encourage my colleagues to come around this common sense solution. The American people already have. Have a town hall meeting on this in your state. I don't care what state you come from. Look at polling on this. The American people have already reached this common sense consensus. The question is Washington going to catch up and follow? Or are we going to reach the same common sense consensus and respond in a common sense way that solves the problem rather than just growing it or throwing money at it? I encourage all of us, Mr. President, from both sides of the aisle to come together around this sort of consensus approach. Of course, I favor the specific legislation I have filed, S 2632, but it doesn't have to be exactly that vehicle. It does have to be that general approach to stop this mounting flood of illegals at our southern border, to deal with this crisis, including the humanitarian crisis, effectively, rather than continuing to deal with it in a way where the numbers, the burden, the crisis, the abuses continue to grow. In closing, Mr. President, let me say that I'm, again, very concerned, as I'm sure every member in this body is, about specific impacts on my state. I mentioned some of those impacts. Now, I didn't get those details from the Department of Homeland Security, even though I specifically asked for them from the department. I've gotten no real cooperation or information from the department. I've had to search these out from other reliable sources. I'm going to continue to do that. I'm going to continue to get that word out to Louisianians, because they deserve to know what we as a state and what our communities may be dealing with. But I would hope, in the meantime, the Department of Homeland Security would actually answer my letter, answer my questions, give us the details directly, so that we all know exactly what we're dealing with as a country and in our individual states. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a